Chapter 1. The ultimatum. I never thought my expertise in human behavioral psychology, something most people dismissed as soft science, would become the last line of defense between Earth and annihilation. Yet here I am, sitting in a dimly lit government bunker beneath Geneva, staring at the shimmering projection of the alien emissary who has just delivered humanity's death sentence. The alien species calls themselves the Veyrath, towering insectoid forms with translucent carapaces that pulse faintly with bioluminescent veins. Their voices are a strange blend of resonance and vibration, as if spoken through a cello string stretched too tight. They are not here to negotiate. They are here to dominate. You have 7 Earth days, the emissary declared, its mandibles clicking in rhythm with each syllable. Submit to Veyrath sovereignty or be erased. The room fell silent after that pronouncement. Generals, diplomats, scientists all frozen as if the weight of inevitability had crushed their ability to think. But I noticed something, a flicker, a pause, a subtle hesitation in the alien's cadence when it spoke the word sovereignty. It was the kind of micro-expression I'd trained my entire career to detect in humans. And now I realized it might be the crack in the armor of an empire. I am not a soldier, I am not a spy. I am an ordinary human expert in psychological micropatterns, deception detection, and cognitive bias. My life's work has been teaching corporations how to spot liars in boardrooms and helping courts identify false testimony. But now my skill set is being weaponized against a species that believes itself infallible. The Veyrath's arrogance is palpable. They do not hide their contempt for us. They believe their empire is eternal, their logic flawless, their dominance inevitable. Yet arrogance breeds blindness, and blindness can be exploited. I leaned forward, breaking the silence. They're not as unified as they claim, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. That hesitation wasn't random. It was fear of contradiction. They need us to accept their sovereignty, not just endure it. That means their legitimacy depends on our compliance. If we refuse in the right way, we can fracture their psychology. The generals scoffed. Refuse, they'll burn the planet. No, I countered. Not if refusal undermines their authority. They're not just conquerors, they're bureaucrats of domination. Their empire runs on rules, rituals, and psychological control. If we can expose a flaw in that system, we don't need weapons. We need precision. We need to make them doubt themselves. The alien projection flickered out, leaving only the stale air of the bunker. I could feel every eye on me now. For the first time in my life, my ordinary expertise wasn't a curiosity, it was the only plan we had. I opened my notebook, the same battered, leather-bound journal I'd carried for years, and began sketching the outlines of a strategy. Not military maneuvers, not resistance cells, but psychological warfare through bureaucracy, semantics, and the exploitation of cognitive dissonance. If the Veyrath Empire was built on the illusion of perfect authority, then I would find the imperfection, and I would drive a wedge into it until the whole edifice cracked. 7 days, that was all the time Earth had left. And I intended to use every second to prove that an ordinary human expert could outthink an empire. Would you like me to continue Chapter 2 with the first steps of the narrator's psychological counteroffensive, perhaps the initial infiltration into the alien bureaucracy? Chapter 2. The paperwork of power. The bunker smelled of recycled air and desperation. Generals muttered about troop movements, diplomats whispered about surrender terms, and scientists scribbled equations that would never be tested. None of it mattered. The Veyrath had already won, at least in their minds. They had declared Earth a subordinate territory, and their decree carried the weight of inevitability. But inevitability is fragile when it rests on procedure. I spent the next hours poring over the fragments of their transmissions, dissecting every syllable, every pause. The Veyrath spoke in a language that was half command, half ritual. Their words were not just threats, they were filings, proclamations, entries in a ledger of domination. And in that ledger I saw something extraordinary. They required acknowledgement. Not obedience, not silence, but acknowledgement. Without it, their authority was incomplete. That was the flaw. I drafted a counter-document, a refusal disguised as compliance. A statement so meticulously crafted that it would appear to follow their rules while subtly undermining them. Every clause mirrored their syntax, every phrase echoed their cadence, but buried within was contradiction. A paradox they could not ignore. The generals scoffed again when I explained. You think paperwork will save us? I closed my notebook and met their gaze. Not paperwork, psychology, bureaucracy is their battlefield. If we fight them there, we fight them where they are weakest. The first test came sooner than expected. The Veyrath emissary appeared again, projected in shimmering arrogance, demanding Earth's formal submission. I stood before the council and read our response aloud. My voice was steady, though my heart hammered like a drum. We acknowledge the sovereignty of the Veyrath Empire, I began, in accordance with the principles of mutual recognition, provided that such sovereignty does not contradict the inherent autonomy of Earth's governance. The alien's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second. That micro-expression, that tiny fracture of certainty, was all the proof I needed. They had heard the paradox. To accept our acknowledgement, they had to accept our autonomy. To reject it, they had to reject their own demand for acknowledgement. The room was silent. The generals leaned forward. The emissary's projection wavered, its voice caught between fury and hesitation. I had struck the first blow, not with weapons but with words, not with armies but with contradictions. And as the projection dissolved into static, I realized something chilling. The Verath were not invincible. They were bound by their own rules, shackled by the bureaucracy of their empire. 7 days remained, but now Earth had a weapon, a paradox, a wedge, and I was the one holding it. The static of the Verath projection fizzled into nothing, leaving the war room's harsh fluorescent lights humming like a held breath. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. Then General Hale slammed his fist on the table so hard the coffee pot rattled. "That was a fluke," he snarled, his face flushed under his close-cropped gray hair. "They'll glass us tomorrow and your fancy word games won't stop a single railgun slug." I didn't answer right away. I was too busy picking at the paper cut on my left thumb, the one I'd gotten rifling through 12 years of archived UN interstellar treaty filings at 3 a.m. the night before. The same filings every general and diplomat had dismissed as irrelevant when the Verath first showed up. My hoodie still had a coffee stain on the cuff from the lukewarm brew I'd been chugging for 11 hours straight. My glasses were smudged so bad I could barely read the case numbers scrawled in my notebook. I was a mid-level archivist for the UN's Extraterrestrial Procedural Compliance Office, the guy who used to get made fun of for memorizing footnote clauses no one else bothered to read. The last person anyone expected to be holding humanity's fate. 7 days, I said, meeting Hale's gaze, my voice steadier than I felt. That's not an arbitrary deadline they picked to mess with us. That's the mandatory minimum review period their imperial charter requires for any formal submission invoking their core recognition statutes. I found the clause buried in the 12-page preamble they sent 3 days ago. Everyone skipped it because it was just boring legal boilerplate. They can't destroy or enslave us until that review period is up. If they do, they violate their own founding rules, the same rules they're using to justify taking Earth in the first place. The room went quiet. The Secretary General, who'd been huddled in the corner like he wanted to disappear, leaned forward, his voice quiet. "He's right. I had the legal team cross-reference it an hour ago. That clause is verbatim, they're bound by it." Hale's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just crossed his arms and glared at me like I just told him we could beat the Verath with a pocket calculator. "Fine, you bought us 7 days, what then?" That was the question, wasn't it? I'd spent the 4 hours after the emissary's projection faded dissecting the flaw I'd stumbled on, turning it over in my head like a stone until the edges wore smooth. The Verath didn't just demand acknowledgement from the species they were trying to subjugate. Their entire command structure ran on procedural validation from every tier of their bureaucracy. No field commander, not even the one leading their invasion fleet parked just past the moon, could authorize planetary destruction without a signed clearance from the mid-level compliance officer stationed at their lunar administrative outpost. A 12-person office, no warships, no troops, just functionaries who processed subjugation filings and signed off on compliance checks. That officer's entire career was tied to how many procedural anomalies he resolved correctly. Resolve enough, he got promoted to planetary governor. Miss even one, he was stripped of his rank and sent to the mining colonies on the edge of their empire. I pulled up the schematic of the Verath's lunar outpost on the main screen. It was just a cluster of modular office pods, no weapons, no hangars, just a comms array tied directly to their imperial filing system. "We don't just stall," I said, tapping the screen where the comms array was marked. "We clog their pipeline. We send a formal query to that compliance officer, framed as a submission from a compliant polity seeking to adhere to imperial standards. We embed another paradox in it, one that forces him to engage with it or risk his own career." Hale snorted. "You think a memo is going to stop an alien empire?" "Not a memo," I said, leaning forward. "A trap. Their promotion criteria require them to resolve all valid procedural queries from compliant polities within 48 hours, per their internal charter. If we frame this as a test case he can use to pad his promotion record, he can't ignore it. If he does, his superiors will mark him as negligent. If he engages, he has to log it, schedule it for review, and put a hold on all pending destruction orders for our planet until the case is closed. That's another 10 business days minimum right there." The room was quiet for a long minute, then the Secretary General nodded. "We have the old UN extraterrestrial filing terminal in the basement. It's the only channel still connected to their lunar admin outpost. Military comms are all blocked, but that terminal is registered as a neutral filing hub. They won't touch it. We can send it from there." We spent the next hour drafting the query. I copied their syntax exactly, the half-command, half-ritual cadence I'd pulled from their transmission fragments, every clause mirroring the boilerplate they used for their own filings. The paradox was buried deep in a footnote about promotion eligibility. If the query is deemed a valid test of imperial procedural standards, the compliance officer gains full credit for resolving it. If it's deemed invalid, he's penalized for ignoring a submission from a formally acknowledging compliant polity. No matter what he does, he has to engage. We sent it at 2 a.m., me hunched over the dusty old terminal in the basement, the only sound the hum of its ancient fan and the distant thud of military patrols on the floors above. I hit send, then leaned back in the creaky metal chair, my eyes burning, my stomach twisted into knots. Hale was standing behind me, arms crossed, checking his watch like he was timing how long it took for the Vereth to blow us up for wasting their time. 17 minutes later, the terminal pinged. I jumped so bad my coffee sloshed over the edge of my mug. The screen lit up with the Vereth's official emblem, the swirling opal pattern that looked like a galaxy trapped in stone. The boilerplate text scrolled across first, query received. Case assigned, ver 7742 Delta. Scheduled for review AT Weekly Compliance Sync, 25 July. No planetary subjugation or destruction orders will be processed for Earth until case resolved. PER Imperial Charter Section 9, Paragraph 4. I whooped so loud Hale jumped. The Secretary General clapped me on the back so hard I nearly fell off my chair, but I wasn't looking at the boilerplate. I was zoomed in on the metadata footer, the tiny hand-scrawled notation the compliance officer had added, not part of the official template, written in the messy, hurried scrawl of someone who didn't expect anyone to see it. Delta, curious. I stared at it for a full minute, my pulse thrumming in my ears. He hadn't just logged the query to cover his own ass. He was actually curious about the paradox. He'd taken the time to add a personal note instead of just stamping it and filing it away. "What's it say?" Hale asked, leaning over my shoulder. I pointed to the notation. "He's intrigued. We didn't just buy ourselves 10 days, we got his attention." The room went quiet again. Hale stared at the screen for a long minute, then shook his head, a tiny, disbelieving smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're insane," he said, but there was no bite to it, no scorn, just awe. I was already typing, my fingers flying over the old keyboard, drafting a follow-up. Not a formal submission this time. A private note addressed directly to Kael'thar. His name was in the case header. I'd pulled it from the Vereth's filing registry last week, another useless bit of trivia no one else had bothered to memorize. A supplementary clarification from a compliant polity seeking to aid the Imperial Review Committee's assessment. Another tiny paradox buried in a throwaway line about our planet's cultural records, one that would make Kael'thar want to dig deeper, not just file the case away. 6 days, I said, not looking up from the screen. That's how long until his review meeting. We don't just need to stall them, we need to turn him. Make him so invested in resolving this that he'll start bending his own rules to help us. Make him a liability for his own superiors. The terminal pinged again before I could hit send. New message, no boilerplate, no case number, just 2 words from Kael'thar, typed fast, urgent. Explain the paradox. I stared at the words for a second, then smiled, leaning back in my chair. The hum of the terminal filled the basement, the glow of the screen painting my hands opal blue. Hale was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. The Secretary General was white as a sheet. Outside, the first hints of dawn were bleeding over the horizon. 6 days, 23 hours, 42 minutes left on the clock. But for the first time since the Vereth had appeared in our skies, I didn't feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on my chest. I felt the weight of a pen. And the knowledge that even an empire built on arrogance and rule-following could be taken down, one contradictory clause at a time. I hit send on the follow-up and watched the screen blink. Message delivered to Lunar Outpost COMMS. Somewhere 384,000 kilometers away, a mid-level Vereth bureaucrat was reading my words. His curiosity piqued, his career hanging on how he handled the paradox I'd buried in a footnote. He didn't know it yet. But he was already on our side, and we hadn't fired a single shot. The basement hummed so quiet I could hear the drip of the dehumidifier in the corner, the sharp, ragged breath of the Secretary General behind me. Hale was still staring at the screen, at the message delivered confirmation blinking under my sent note, like he expected it to vanish if he looked at it hard enough. Then the terminal pinged. It was a sharp staccato sound, so loud in the silence that the Secretary General jumped. I'd counted on it. The Vereth don't waste time when they spot a precedent conflict. They're hardwired to chase inconsistencies, to root out anything that threatens the immaculate, unbroken line of their imperial law. It's the only thing they care about more than conquest. The message popped up in the chat window, no boilerplate, no case number, just 2 words typed in that terse, no-nonsense Vereth script that looks like jagged scratches to human eyes, but I'd learned to read it in the 3 weeks since they'd dropped their ultimatum. Explain the paradox. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, a small smile tugging at my mouth. Hale leaned in, squinting at the screen. He's buying it. He's not buying anything. I was already typing, my fingers finding the rhythm they'd had for 30 years when I'd filed thousands of government memos, cross-referenced obscure legal codes, hunted down lost archival records for cases no one else cared about. He's terrified of missing it, that's the point. I didn't rush the response. Every word had to land exactly right, no room for misinterpretation, no hint that we were trying to manipulate him. Just a compliant, slightly confused subordinate polity asking for guidance the way a junior clerk would ask a senior reviewer to clarify a rule they didn't understand. I referenced the footnote I'd buried in the compliance submission. The 12th century Icelandic saga of Hvalsifjord, the part where the village elders sheltered 217 fleeing refugees from a neighboring clan war, gave them food, shelter, medical care, no compensation, no oath of fealty, no strings attached. Then I cited the precedent the Veyrath's own legal team had cited in their ultimatum. Imperial Precedent 742, enacted 412 standard years prior, which classified any polity with documented widespread voluntary non-transactional aid to unrelated sentient beings as subversive to imperial trade stability and eligible for immediate annexation. Then I added the contradiction, plain as day, no rhetorical flourishes. Our archivists have noted that Precedent 742 appears to conflict with Founding Charter Clause 1.1, which exempts all Founder-era cultural practices from retroactive application of post-unification precedents. Historical records indicate the Veyrath homeworld's pre-unification clans practiced identical non-transactional aid to war refugees. Could you please clarify the correct application of these two clauses to ensure our compliance submission is fully accurate and avoids any inadvertent violations of imperial law? I hit send before Hale could lean over and tell me I was being too obvious. The confirmation blinked up. Message delivered to Lunar Outpost COMMS. You're insane. Hale's tone was the same quiet, odd hush he'd used 10 minutes earlier, no bite to it. The Secretary General was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He's going to see right through that. He's going to mark us as insolent, escalate the destruction order. No, he won't. I leaned back in my creaky office chair, the one I dragged down to the basement from my study the day the Veyrath ships appeared. Kael'thar been a mid-level review officer for 12 standard years. He's been passed over for senior reviewer promotion 3 times. The last time his supervisor wrote in his performance review that he lacks the attention to precedent detail required for senior rank. This contradiction. It's the shot he's been waiting for. If he spots it, if he flags it, if he gets credit for finding a conflict in the case his superiors are pushing to rubber stamp, he gets that promotion. If he ignores it and the review committee finds out later, he gets demoted to file clerk. For a Veyrath, that's worse than death. Their entire society is built on rank, on legal precedents, on the idea that the law is infallible. Being proven wrong by their own law doesn't just cost them a job, it erases their identity. The Secretary General stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. You're saying he's going to risk his career for a footnote in our cultural records. I'm saying he's going to risk his career to prove he's better than the supervisors who have been passing him over for years. I nodded at the terminal, which pinged again before I could finish the sentence. The new message was longer this time. The Veyrath script sharper, more urgent, like Kael'thar had been typing fast, his 3-fingered hands tapping hard against the comms console. Citation for Hvalsifjord record required. Provide full archival reference, including cross-references to any VEYRATH Imperial archives that document founder or equivalent practices. Do not submit additional material until this request is fulfilled. Hale let out a low whistle. The Secretary General's jaw dropped. I didn't smile this time, but my chest felt light, like I was floating. That wasn't a dismissal, that was an assignment. Kael'thar wasn't just going to look at our footnote. He was going to dig through the Veyrath's own classified Imperial archives to prove the Founder-era practice existed. He was going to have to request access to files that only senior reviewers can unlock, which meant his supervisors would have to sign off on it. Which meant the entire Imperial Review Committee, the group that was supposed to rubber stamp our extinction order in 4 days, was going to be talking about our case, about the paradox, about Kael'thar's request. We just bought ourselves another week. I turned to the Secretary General, who was still gaping at the screen, maybe more. Every hour he spends digging through those archives is an hour he's not signing our death warrant. What if he finds the Founder-era practice, Hale said, his voice low, and decides the contradiction doesn't matter? What if he just writes a memo saying the exemption doesn't apply to non-Veyrath polities and moves to approve the order? He won't. I leaned forward, tapping the screen where Kael'thar's message was still displayed. Because to write that memo, he has to explicitly state that the founding charter, the bedrock of the entire Veyrath imperial legal system, only applies to Veyrath citizens. That memo gets filed permanently in the imperial record. There are thousands of lower-ranked Veyrath bureaucrats, guys like Kael'thar who have been passed over for promotion, guys who have been punished for minor precedent conflicts, who have been waiting for a piece of evidence like that to take down the Imperial Council. Kael'thar knows that, if he writes that memo, he's giving them the ammunition they need to overthrow the entire government. He's not going to do that unless he has no other choice, and right now. He thinks he can resolve this contradiction without escalating it. He thinks he can find a loophole or a prior ruling that lets him rule in our favor without rocking the boat. So he's going to stall. He's going to dig. He's going to ask for more clarifications, more citations, more cross-references for as long as he can. I glanced at the clock on the wall above the terminal. The red digital numbers glowed in the dim basement light. 6 days, 19 hours, 12 minutes. For the first time since the Veyrath had appeared in our skies 18 months prior, the numbers didn't feel like a countdown to the end. They felt like a clock ticking down to a meeting, to a fight, to a chance. We hadn't fired a single shot. We hadn't built a single weapon. All we had was a stack of old sagas, a 30-year career filing government paperwork, and a bunch of arrogant aliens who cared more about looking consistent than they did about wiping out a species. And for the first time in 18 months, I thought we might actually win. The hum of the basement server racks was the only sound for a full minute, until Hale's fingers finally stopped trembling long enough for her to tap the refresh button on Kael'thar's query page again. The Veyrath's public imperial docket glowed on the main screen, its sharp, angular script scrolling so fast I could barely make out the individual comments. 17 of them now, all posted in the 40 minutes since Kael'thar had submitted his initial request for Founding-era archival cross-references. Half were snarky remarks from mid-tier council functionaries, berating him for wasting imperial resources on a moot point and demanding he sign the extinction order before the 7-day review window expired. The other half were from junior archivists and low-ranked clerks, all variations of the same warning. If you rule against the humans, you set a precedent that the founding charter only applies to Veyrath citizens. The oversight committees will have your rank before the ink is dry. If you rule for them, the council will flay you alive. Good luck. I'd seen that exact dynamic 100 times in my 30 years at the National Archives. Bureaucracies don't run on orders from the top. They run on the quiet, unspoken agreement of the people who actually do the work, the ones who know where the skeletons are buried, who hold the collective power to make any executive order unenforceable if it crosses a line they've all agreed not to cross. The Veyrath Council thought they could snap their fingers and erase us because they'd never had to deal with a species whose entire history was built on the same red tape, the same petty precedent-chasing, the same quiet sabotage of bad bosses that I'd spent my career navigating. They'd forgotten their own empire was held together by it. He's stalling, I said, leaning forward to scroll through the comment thread, but he's stalling badly. He's asking for clarifications on 12 different subclauses of the charter, which will take him at least 3 more days just to get responses to. The council's already breathing down his neck. He needs a way out he can sell to both sides. Hale's jaw tight. What if there is no way out? What if he just writes a memo saying the exemption doesn't apply to non-Veyrath polities like I said before? He won't. I tapped the screen where a comment from a junior archivist was warning Kael'thar that the lower ranks were already drafting formal complaints about the extinction order. Because to write that memo, he has to hand the oversight committees exactly the ammunition they've been waiting for. But right now, he thinks he can find a loophole that lets him rule for us without admitting the charter applies to non-citizens. He just needs a precedent he can point to cover his own ass with the council. I opened a separate tab I'd pulled up for months, a digitized copy of the Veyrath Founding Charter's legislative history I downloaded when we first started prepping for the review. 6 months ago when the Veyrath first appeared over our cities, and I was pulled into this basement to comb through every scrap of their public legal code, I'd stumbled on a footnote I'd almost written off as irrelevant. A species called the Lyarth, contacted by Veyrath exploration vessels in 1127 Imperial Standard, 400 years before the charter was written. They had 1,200 years of continuous, documented planetary governance when the Veyrath found them. No spaceflight, no valuable resources, just a small agrarian species with a written constitution older than most of the Veyrath's core worlds. The Veyrath had signed a mutual non-aggression pact with them, explicitly recognizing their sovereignty, and the Lyarth had died off 200 years later in an asteroid impact that turned their home moon into a crater. Their case had been cited exactly once in the Charter's drafting notes, as an example of the non-interference with established polities principle that became the 1,000-year governance exemption. But when the Vareth had digitized their physical archives 200 years prior, someone had misfiled the Lyarth case under pre-imperial ecological studies. Extinct species instead of charter precedent, non-Vareth polities. No one had ever found it because no one had ever had reason to look for a non-Vareth precedent for the exemption. Until now. We don't have to wait for Kael'thar to find it, I said, turning to Hale, who was watching me like I'd lost my mind. We can give it to him? I explained the plan in 30 seconds, the same way I'd explain a filing procedure to a new intern. Post a comment on Kael'thar's public query from a throwaway Varath archivist account, pointing him to the misfiled Lyarth case, upvote it from a dozen throwaway human research accounts so it rises to the top of his feed. He'll see it, assume it's a helpful tip from a colleague, pull the file and find the exact precedent he needs to rule in our favor without contradicting the charter. Hale shook her head immediately. What if he thinks it's a plant? What if he checks the file, decides the Lyarth don't count because they didn't have a unified planetary defense force, or whatever nitpick he can come up with and just moves to approve the order? He won't. I pulled up the fake archivist account I'd registered 6 months ago when I was first testing Vareth docket access. Its digital footprint was spotless. A few comments on archival policy threads, a handful of likes on posts about pre-imperial history, no red flags. Kael'thar's not fighting for the humans, he's fighting for his own neck. Right now he's trapped, rule against us and the lower ranks will mutiny, rule for us and the council will flay him alive. The Lyarth case gives him a third option. He can rule for us, cite binding precedent, and no one can touch him without starting a bureaucratic civil war. The council knows that. Kael'thar knows that. He's been hoping for a loophole like this for weeks. He's not going to ignore a random colleague pointing him to it. Hale hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Do it. I typed the comment fast, keeping the tone exactly right. Brusque, helpful, the kind of throwaway tip a junior archivist would post to help a mid-tier functionary avoid making a mistake. Query author, have you considered cross-referencing pre-imperial contact case files for analogous non-Vareth polities? The Lyarth case from 1127 is a direct match for the exemption criteria, currently misfiled under X7782 Alpha Ecological Studies, Extinct Species. The Lyarth had 1,200 years of continuous documented governance when first contacted, and the Vareth explicitly recognized their sovereignty in the 1127 Non-Aggression Pact, which was later cited as foundational to the 1,000-year exemption clause. Worth reviewing? I hit post, then switched to the throwaway human research accounts we'd registered for cultural exchange access to the Varath docket, upvoting the comment from 10 different IP addresses spread across 3 continents. It rose to the top of the thread in 90 seconds, pushing the snarky council comments and the venting clerks down to the bottom. Then we waited. The minutes stretched thin. Hale paced the length of the basement, her boots scuffing the concrete. My coffee had gone cold an hour prior, but I didn't dare move to get a refill, my eyes locked on the docket tab. The countdown on the wall glowed unchanging, 6 days, 19 hours, 12 minutes. 10 minutes passed. Then a tiny notification popped up next to Kael'thar's username. He'd upvoted the comment. Hale froze mid-pace. I didn't breathe. 12 minutes after that, Kael'thar's query page updated. New post marked query update scrolled to the top, requesting expedited retrieval of case file X7782 Alpha for cross-reference with current exemption criteria. Estimated review completion, 4 standard hours. No further clarifications requested at this time. Hale let out a quiet, shaky laugh, pressing a hand to her mouth like she was afraid she'd start crying. You didn't just buy us another week. You just bought us a preliminary ruling. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes until stars burst behind my lids. The countdown on the wall still ticked down, but the numbers didn't feel like a death sentence anymore. They felt like a timeline. 4 hours from now, Kael'thar finds the Lyarth case. 8 hours from now, he posts a preliminary ruling that Earth qualifies for the exemption, citing the Lyarth precedent. The Council can't overrule that preliminary ruling without triggering 1,000 docketed complaints, a dozen internal investigations, and probably a coup attempt within the lower ranks. They'll have to either accept the ruling or spend months trying to rewrite the founding charter, time we can use to build something better than a loophole. Time to make sure they never come back. I looked at the comment thread, where now dozens of lower-ranked Varath bureaucrats had piled on, upvoting the Lyarth tip, adding their own notes about how they'd learned about the case in archival training, how it was a perfect match. The Varath had come to our sky expecting to fight a species of chaotic, warmongering primitives who'd spend their last days firing useless nuclear missiles at their ships. They hadn't counted on the fact that the same petty, precedent-obsessed, rule-twisting bureaucracy that had driven me crazy for 30 years was the exact thing that would save us all. For the first time in 18 months, I didn't just think we might win. I knew it. Chapter 6. The Lyarth precedent. The 4 hours crawled by like insects across glass. Every tick of the countdown was a reminder that the Vareth Council's patience was measured not in compassion but in procedural deadlines. Hale kept pacing, muttering fragments of old case law under her breath, as if rehearsing for a trial that would never come. I stayed glued to the docket feed, watching Kael'thar's profile flicker with activity. Then it happened. A new entry appeared, stamped with the crimson insignia of the Council's Bureau of Exceptions, Preliminary Ruling Draft, Earth Petition X7782 Alpha. I opened it with trembling fingers. The words were dry, bureaucratic, and utterly beautiful. Based on precedent established in Lyarth v. Council, Charter Year 11, Docket 4421, Earth's classification as a developing planetary polity qualifies for temporary exemption from immediate annexation or destruction. Pending full review, enforcement actions are suspended. Suspended. One word and the guillotine above our necks froze mid-swing. Hale collapsed into the nearest chair, laughing and sobbing at once. They can't touch us, not without rewriting the charter, and they won't risk that. It would unravel their entire empire. I leaned forward, scanning every clause, every footnote. The Lyarth case had been buried for centuries, a forgotten dispute over a minor colony that had resisted taxation. The council had ruled in Lyarth's favor not out of mercy but because the clerks had bungled the filing order. That clerical error had metastasized into precedent, and now, centuries later, it was our shield. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. The council was arrogant, yes, but not stupid. They would probe the ruling, test its boundaries, search for loopholes to undo our loophole, and when they did, we had to be ready. I opened a private channel to Kael'thar. You've given us breathing room, but they'll come for you for this ruling. You know that? His reply was instant, curt. I am aware, but the charter binds us all, even them. If they break it openly, they fracture the empire. If they bend it quietly, they risk exposure. Either way, Earth survives for now. For now, I closed the channel and stared at the countdown. It hadn't stopped. It had simply shifted. 6 days, 19 hours, 12 minutes until the council's next session. 6 days until they tried to claw back their authority. 6 days until we had to turn a temporary reprieve into permanent immunity. Hale wiped her eyes and straightened. So what's next? I exhaled slowly, the weight of 30 years in bureaucratic trenches pressing down on me. Next, we weaponize their own psychology. The council thrives on hierarchy, on the illusion of infallibility. If we can make them doubt their own clerks, their own procedures, their own sacred charter, they'll tear themselves apart trying to fix it, and we'll be standing in the wreckage, still free. The basement felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting to expose the fatal flaw at the heart of the empire, their obsession with rules, their blind faith in bureaucracy. I picked up my cold coffee, swallowed it in one bitter gulp, and set the mug down with finality. We've bought time. Now we buy chaos? And in that moment I realized the war for Earth would not be fought with weapons or armies, it would be fought in comment threads, docket queues, and precedent archives, and I was the only soldier who knew the terrain. The council thought they understood humanity. They didn't. They thought bureaucracy was their fortress. They were wrong. It was our weapon. Would you like me to push deeper into the psychological flaw itself in Chapter 7? How the council's obsession with hierarchy and precedent becomes the lever we use to dismantle them, or keep the suspense simmering with more espionage and clerical maneuvering before the reveal. Chapter 7. The clerk's shadow. I had always believed the council's clerks were invisible, faceless cogs in the empire's machinery. But invisibility is a kind of power, and power, when left unchecked, breeds arrogance. The flaw was simple, almost laughably so. The council's entire hierarchy depended on the assumption that clerks were infallible. Their word was treated as law, their filings as sacred. If a clerk misfiled a petition, the error became precedent. If a clerk misinterpreted a statute, the misinterpretation became doctrine. The council trusted them blindly because to admit fallibility at the lowest rung would unravel the illusion of perfection at the top. That was the lever. I spent the next 2 days buried in archives, tracing the fingerprints of clerical mistakes across centuries of rulings. Each one was a hairline fracture in the empire's foundation. I cataloged them, cross-referenced them, and built a lattice of contradictions so dense it could choke their entire system. Hale hovered behind me, restless. You're building a bomb out of paperwork. Not a bomb, I corrected, eyes fixed on the screen. A mirror. When they look into it, they'll see themselves fallible, human, weak, and they'll tear each other apart trying to deny it. The suspense was unbearable. Every keystroke felt like a countdown. 6 days had become 4, then 3. The council's next session loomed, and I knew they would come armed with their own clerks, their own archivists, their own smug certainty. That was why I needed Kael'thar, not his loyalty, he had none, but his pride. He was a defector, yes, but more importantly, he was a clerk. He knew the rituals, the sacred gestures, the way a single misplaced seal could ripple through the empire like a contagion. When I finally reached him, his voice was taut with unease. you've found the fractures. But if you expose them too directly, the council will silence you, they'll erase the record, erase you. I leaned closer to the transmitter. Then we don't expose them directly, we seed doubt, quietly. We leak contradictions into their docket. We let their own clerks stumble over the errors, and when they do, the council will have to choose, admit fallibility or deny the charter itself. Kael'thar was silent for a long moment. Then, you're playing with fire. Fire is all we have. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. We would plant a single contradiction, an ancient ruling that invalidated a newer one buried deep in the archives. When the council's clerks tried to reconcile the two, they would be forced to admit that one of them was wrong. And once they admitted that, the illusion of infallibility would shatter. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. I wasn't a soldier, wasn't a spy. I was an ordinary human expert in bureaucracy, a man who had spent his life navigating forms and precedents. And yet here I was, holding the fate of Earth in my hands, armed with nothing but clerical errors. The council thought hierarchy was their fortress. They thought precedent was their shield, but in truth it was their prison, and I was about to lock the door. As I prepared the final insertion into the docket queue, Hale whispered, "What if they see through it?" I swallowed hard. "Then Earth burns, but if they don't, the Empire burns instead." And with one keystroke, I sent the contradiction into the heart of their system. The shadow of the clerk had become our weapon. Would you like Chapter 8 to show the Council's reaction in their session, how the contradiction begins to unravel their hierarchy, or keep the focus on our tense waiting, watching the trap slowly close? The keystroke echoed in my skull louder than the bunker's low, constant hum. For a second I couldn't breathe. The cursor on my terminal blinked once, twice, then vanished as the file I'd spent 6 months curating. Kael'thar's buried 1122 founding charter ruling paired with the missing 1472 certification of the Earth Annexation Edict's procedural invalidity slid into the pre-session docket queue, encrypted with the Vera's own clerical signature so deep it would look like it had been sitting there for 800 years. Hale's hand landed on my shoulder, her grip tight enough to bruise through her uniform. "It's done," I nodded, but my throat was too dry to speak. I'd spent 12 years as a mid-level archivist for the UN's Extraterrestrial Bureaucratic Liaison Office, filing permit requests for alien trade convoys and disputing parking tickets for Vera diplomatic shuttles. I'd never held a gun, never run an op, never done anything more exciting than win a 3-year dispute over whether a Vera cargo freighter's waste disposal permit qualified for tax-exempt status. And now I just bet the lives of 8 billion humans on a clerical error. The next 72 hours dragged like wet concrete. We didn't sleep. The bunker's air smelled like burnt coffee and stale sweat. My International Association of Administrative Professionals hoodie, the one with the coffee stain on the cuff from a 2029 conference, was glued to my back. I refreshed Kael'thar's backdoor feed every 10 minutes, scanning the Vera docket server for any sign they'd flagged the planted file. For the first 34 hours, nothing. I started to think we'd miscalculated, that the council's clerks were too arrogant to bother cross-referencing old rulings, that we just handed them a free pass to glass Earth. Then, at hour 36, the first blip. A junior clerk in the council's pre-session review division had flagged a discrepancy between the 1122 founding ruling on annexation eligibility and the 2147 Earth Annexation Edict. Kael'thar's feed lit up with the internal chat log, redacted but readable. The clerk, a low-ranking Vera named Xylth, had written rulings conflict. 1122 specifies annexation prohibited for species with 200-plus years stable interplanetary governance, no FTL capability requirement. 2147 specifies annexation mandatory for all non-FTL species. Human colony records show 217 years stable governance, 2 off-world colonies. Discrepancy unaddressed. I held my breath. This was the moment. The Vera built their entire imperial hierarchy on the myth of infallible precedent. Every council ruling, every edict, every law was framed as a perfect, unchallengeable extension of the founding charter. A single unaddressed discrepancy wasn't just a paperwork error. It was a crack in the foundation of their entire identity, a crack that could split their empire apart before they ever fired a shot at Earth. The clerk's supervisor replied 12 minutes later, log as transcription error. Refile under 2147 edict addenda, do not escalate. Xylth didn't log it as a transcription error. I watched, heart hammering, as he bypassed his supervisor and tagged the Clerical Oversight Assembly, the independent 10,000-member body of senior clerks who were the de facto guardians of Vera precedent and the council's only formal check on power. Kael'thar had told me they hated the council, resented being treated as rubber stamps for the ruler's whims, but they'd never dared challenge them openly. Until now, hour 48, the Oversight Assembly opened a formal inquiry. The council found out within the hour. Kael'thar patched the council chamber audio into my feed just as the emergency session was gavelled to order. I recognized the lead counselor, Thalkar, the one who'd given Earth's UN delegation the 72-hour ultimatum to surrender or be glassed, his four-jawed face twisting with rage. "This is a xenogenic hack," he snarled, his mandibles clicking. "The humans have contaminated our docket to undermine our lawful annexation. We will glass their planet at dawn and purge every clerk involved in this farce." The High Clerk, the head of the clerical assembly, didn't flinch. Her voice was ice, no trace of the deference the council was used to. "The 1122 Charter is carved into the foundation stone of the Imperial Spire, Counselor. It cannot be hacked. The discrepancy is real." The 2147 Edict has not been certified by a 3/4 quorum of the Clerical Assembly, as required by the Charter's Amendment Clause. The certification record is missing. Thalkar laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "The record was lost in the 2097 archive fire. We have operated under the edict for 50 years. It is binding. Binding only if it does not conflict with the founding charter," the High Clerk said, "which it does. The humans meet every eligibility criterion for annexation exemption. The edict is invalid." The chamber erupted. I could hear counselors shouting, the gavel banging over and over. Thalkar was screaming that they would suspend the charter temporarily to override the ruling, that the clerical assembly had no authority to block a council decision on planetary security. I froze. Suspending the charter was the nuclear option. The Vera had only done it once in 1022 to put down a slave revolt in the Outer Rim. It had triggered a 100-year civil war that killed 2 billion Vera. If they did it now, the Empire would tear itself apart from the inside, but they'd still have time to glass Earth before the chaos spread. "Hail," I said, my voice steady even as my hands shook. "Prep the EMP burst. If they vote to suspend the charter, we trigger it." She nodded, her hand already on the launch console. 30% survival rate for the eastern seaboard, 45% for the interior. The orbital platforms will be disabled before they can fire. I turned back to the feed. The council was voting. The result came back seconds later, 6-6, deadlocked. The charter required a 2-3 majority to suspend it, and half the councilors refused to vote for it, knowing it would trigger a civil war that would wash over their own home worlds. Thalkar slammed his fist on the dais so hard the audio cracked. "Then we will refer the matter to the clerical assembly for a full vote." "Will side with us." The High Clerk smiled, a cold, sharp thing I'd never seen on a Vera's face before. "The assembly has already opened a full review. The junior clerk who found the discrepancy submitted 300 pages of supporting evidence this morning, including the missing 1472 certification record you claimed was lost in the fire. It was not lost. It was buried by your own chief of staff in 2146 before the edict was passed." The chamber went silent. I leaned back in my chair, the tension bleeding out of my shoulders so fast I almost giggled. Kael'thar had found that record 3 years ago when he defected, buried under a pile of tax filings for Thalkar's private interstellar estate. We hadn't forged a single thing. We just moved it from the archive where he'd hidden it to the docket queue where their own overworked, underappreciated clerks would find it. The audio crackled again, this time with the public address "Feed the Vera" broadcast to every world in their empire. "The Clerical Assembly has voted 9,821 to 179 to uphold the 1122 founding charter ruling," the High Clerk announced, her voice carrying across the void. "The 2147 Earth Annexation Edict is hereby null and void. All Imperial forces en route to the Sol system are ordered to stand down and return to base immediately. Any counselor who attempts to override this ruling will be arrested for violation of the founding charter." I could hear Thalkar screaming in the background, but the feed cut off. Kael'thar's text popped up on my terminal a second later. "Told you doubt was more dangerous than a dreadnought." Hale slumped against the console next to me, laughing so hard she was crying. Outside the bunker, we could hear the distant cheers of the people in the command center, the red invasion alerts that had been blaring for 72 hours cutting off all at once, replaced by the soft green of all clear. I picked up my cold coffee mug, took a sip, and looked at the screen showing the Vera fleet's trajectory already plotted away from Sol. No one had died, no ships had been destroyed, no bombs had been dropped, just a bunch of old paperwork, a bunch of underpaid clerks, and a bunch of arrogant aliens who'd forgotten that the rules they used to enslave others could also be used to set them free. I'm still just a bureaucrat. I still file parking tickets for alien shuttles when they park in the UN garage without a permit. But every now and then, when I walk past the small memorial in the basement of the UN building for the 72-hour ultimatum, I smile. Because the most powerful weapon in the universe is a dreadnought, or a plasma cannon, or a fleet of warships, it's a misplaced seal on a form. Chapter 9 The claws that broke the crown. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt the gnawing weight of unfinished business. The Vera fleet had turned back, yes, but Thalkar was not finished. He was too proud, too steeped in the Empire's culture of domination to accept humiliation quietly. And arrogance, I had learned, was not just a personality trait among the Vera, it was a structural flaw. Their entire psychology was built on the assumption that no one beneath them could ever understand the rules well enough to use them against them. That flaw was my weapon. The chamber emptied after the ruling, but I stayed behind, staring at the glowing docket screen. The founding charter was vast, tens of thousands of clauses, amendments, and procedural footnotes. Most humans would have drowned in its labyrinthine language. But I had spent years in the UN's dusty archives, cross-referencing alien treaties with human municipal codes, learning how their bureaucracy ticked. And I knew something Thalkar didn't. The charter contained a clause about psychological competency. It was buried deep, written centuries ago when the Vera had first conquered their neighboring species. It stated that any counselor found to be psychologically compromised by arrogance to the point of irrational governance could be declared unfit to rule. The clause had never been invoked. It was a relic, a joke among clerks, but it was real. I pulled up the record, my hands trembling. The clause required evidence, patterns of irrationality, documented contradictions, proof of decisions made against the Empire's own interest. And Thalkar had left a trail a mile wide. His obsession with Earth had cost the Empire billions in wasted resources, diverted fleets, and endless clerical disputes. He had screamed at clerks, threatened auditors, and even falsified his own expense reports. I began assembling the file. Every insult he had hurled at the Assembly, every contradictory order he had issued, every time he had violated the Charter's own language. Hale helped me cross-reference the dates, while Kael'thar fed us insider memos from his defection cache. Piece by piece, we built a psychological portrait not of a mighty overlord but of a dangerously unstable bureaucrat. The suspense was unbearable. If the Assembly accepted our petition, Thalkar would be stripped of authority, his rulings voided, his empire forced to acknowledge that arrogance itself was a disqualifying illness. If they rejected it, Earth would be back under threat within weeks. I filed the petition at midnight. The docket clerk barely looked at me, just stamped it with the imperial seal and slid it into the queue. 3 days later, the public feed lit up again. The Clerical Assembly has reviewed Petition 9812B, the High Clerk intoned. Councillor Thalkar has been declared psychologically incompetent under Clause 77 of the Founding Charter. His rulings are void, his authority is revoked. He is hereby remanded to the custodial tribunal for treatment. The chamber erupted, not with cheers this time but with stunned silence. The Empire had never admitted weakness, never acknowledged that arrogance could be a flaw, and now by their own law they had. I leaned back, heart-pounding. I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a spy, I was just an ordinary human expert in paperwork. But I had found the crack in their psychology, the clause they had forgotten, the flaw they had buried under centuries of pride, and I had used it to save Earth. For the first time, I realized the war was not about fleets or weapons, it was about minds. And the Vera mind, for all its grandeur, had just been undone by a single line of text. Would you like me to push Chapter 10 deeper into the fallout? How the Empire reacts to the humiliation of admitting arrogance as a mental defect, or keep the focus tightly on Earth's fragile relief, and the human cost of living under that 72-hour ultimatum? Chapter 10, the hum of the data center servers was the only sound in the bunker for the first hour after the ruling. Half-empty cans of lukewarm coffee littered the folding tables, legal pads stacked in uneven towers, a half-eaten pepperoni pizza gone cold under a stack of printed charter clauses. Hale was snoring on a cot in the corner, his head resting on a pad covered in cross-reference Vera tax codes, and Kael'thar paced the length of the room, his pale blue Vera skin dimming to slate with every step, the faint bioluminescent freckles along his jaw flickering like a dying bulb. My phone buzzed against the metal table, the screen lighting up with a text from Leela, my little sister back in Des Moines. Neighborhood Watch passed out batteries and water at the community center. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought her famous chocolate chip cookies. No one's panicking, but no one's celebrating either. We're just waiting. I stared at the text, then back at the Assembly's public docket, the ruling for Petition 9812B still glowing at the top of the feed. Councillor Thalkar declared psychologically incompetent under Clause 77 of the Founding Chart. RULINGS voided. Authority REVOKED. Remanded to custodial tribunal for treatment. It should have felt like a victory. It was a victory. But I'd spent 3 years as the senior zoning clerk for Des Moines, arguing with developers who tried to slip loopholes into variance requests, and I knew better than to trust a ruling that felt too clean. The Vera weren't stupid. They'd let us use their own law to take down Thalkar, but they hadn't given up on the Earth Extinction Order. They just swapped out the face of the guy holding the gun. Kael'thar, I said, not looking up from my tablet. Pull up the full text of Clause 77 again, not the summary the High Clerk read. The full unredacted version from the charter archive you stole. He stopped pacing, his fingers flying across his own tablet as he pulled up the file. The Vera script scrolled across the screen, and he translated line by line, his voice tight. Clause 77 defines psychological incompetence as a persistent pattern of decision-making that violates the core tenets of the Charter, demonstrates inability to prioritize imperial interests over personal obsession, or exhibits repeated disregard for established procedural law. Subsection 77A covers immediate removal of authority. Subsection 77B, he paused, his eyes widening. Subsection 77B states that any action taken by a counselor later declared incompetent is automatically tabled for 90 solar days, pending review by the custodial tribunal, to prevent corrupt actors from pushing through last-minute harmful policies before removal. I felt the blood drain from my face. The High Clerk hadn't read subsection 77B during the public ruling. They'd only invoked 77A, the removal part. That meant Thalkar's original Earth annihilation order wasn't just voided, it was tabled, but only if someone formally invoked the subsection. If no one did, the order was just gone. And any counselor could introduce a new, identical order, and it would only need a simple majority to pass, because Thalkar's original directive was still technically on the Assembly's agenda, just without his signature. I shook Hale awake so hard his glasses went flying. He mumbled, swatting at my hand until I shoved my tablet in his face, the charter clause glowing bright. He went silent, his lawyer brain kicking in immediately, and started pulling up the Assembly's procedural rules. "You're right," he said, his voice rough with sleep. The High Clerk either missed the subsection on purpose, to leave the door open for a new order, or they were so eager to throw Thalkar under the bus they didn't bother reading the fine print. Either way, we have 6 hours until the Assembly's next session to file a supplemental petition invoking 77B. If we don't, Vorath will introduce a new annihilation order before lunch, and it'll pass. The hawkish counselors have been itching to wipe Earth out for months, they just needed an excuse to not look like they're backing Thalkar's bad calls. Kael'thar nodded, his markings flaring bright with urgency. Vorath is already drafting the order. I saw a memo from his office on the internal feed an hour ago. He's framing it as correcting Thalkar's error by finishing the job he started. The countdown was ticking. Thalkar's original 72-hour ultimatum had been set to expire in 18 hours when the ruling came down. Now, 12 hours later, we had 6 hours to file the petition, get it on the docket, and make the Assembly invoke the 90-day tabling period before Vorath could introduce his new order. I didn't waste time. I'd written hundreds of supplemental zoning petitions in my old job, arguing for bike lanes and affordable housing setbacks against developers who tried to slip every loophole they could find into the city code. I knew how to write something that the Vera couldn't ignore. No emotional appeals, no pleas for mercy, just precise, line-by-line citations of their own law, no extra words, no fluff. Kael'thar translated as I wrote, his fingers flying across the keyboard to match my dictation. Header, supplemental petition to formalize disposition of petition 9812B filed by Kael'thar of Vera Colony 7, defected citizen and legal resident of Earth on behalf of the planet Earth. Case citation, Founding Charter of the Vera Ascendancy, Clause 77B. Supporting evidence, full text of Clause 77B, attached as Exhibit A, public transcript of the High Clerk's ruling on petition 9812B attached as Exhibit B, proof that Councillor Vorath is drafting a new Earth-related directive attached as Exhibit C. Kael'thar had hacked Vorath's internal memo server in 10 minutes flat. Requested action, formal invocation of Clause 77B, tabled all actions related to the original Thalkar Earth mandate for 90 solar days, pending review by the custodial tribunal. We filed it electronically 42 minutes before the session opened. The High Clerk tried to reject it immediately, his voice shrill over the public feed. This petition is out of order. The Assembly has already ruled on petition 9812B. I leaned into the mic in the bunker, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the tablet. With all due respect, High Clerk, Clause 77B is a mandatory provision of the founding charter. The Assembly's ruling on 9812B invoked only subsection 77A. Subsection 77B is automatically triggered upon declaration of incompetence, no additional vote required. Your failure to invoke it in the original ruling does not nullify the clause. Kael'thar, as a defected Vera citizen, has full standing to file this supplemental petition under Article 3, Section 4 of the Charter, which grants all defected citizens the right to petition the Assembly on matters affecting their host planet. Rejection of this petition would be a violation of the Charter itself. The chamber went quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the Vera Assembly's own servers over the feed, and then the High Clerk sighed, defeated. The petition is accepted. It will be the first item on the docket. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. Hale drafted a 10-page supporting brief citing 17 separate precedents of the Custodial Tribunal invoking 77B to block last-minute policy pushes from ousted counselors. Kael'thar monitored the internal Vera feeds, reporting that Voreth was screaming at his staff, that half the assembly was already planning to vote against the petition, that the hawkish faction was circulating a memo calling us sentient pests abusing bureaucratic loopholes. When the session opened, the High Clerk tried to rush through the formal revocation of Thalkar's orders first, but Kael'thar had already flagged the supplemental petition as the first item on the docket. The High Clerk had no choice but to call it first. I sat in the bunker, mic muted, as Kael'thar read the petition aloud, his Vera accent sharp and precise. The chamber erupted the second he finished. Voreth stood up, his scaled face flushed with rage, and slammed his fist on the podium. This is absurd. We are wasting time on a technicality while a primitive species occupies a resource-rich system. Thalkar was a fool, but his order was correct. We should vote to point of order. The High Clerk cut in, his voice weary. Counselor Voreth, any directive related to the original Thalkar Earth mandate is automatically tabled under Clause 77B, per the Assembly's own precedent. You cannot introduce a new order on the subject until the 90-day tabling period expires and the Custodial Tribunal has completed its review of Thalkar's incompetence ruling. Voreth sputtered, but he couldn't argue with the charter. The vote was called, 62 in favor of invoking the 90-day tabling period, 38 against. The ruling flashed across the public feed 5 minutes later. All actions related to the Thalkar Earth mandate are tabbed for 90 solar days, pending Custodial Tribunal review. No action may be taken against the planet Earth during this period. The bunker exploded. Hale whooped so loud he woke up the security guard outside the door. Kael'thar's markings flared bright gold, and he grabbed my shoulders, laughing, a sound I'd never heard from him before. I sat there for a minute staring at the ruling, and then I pulled out my phone and texted Leela, 90 days, no bombs, no ships, nothing, just 90 days. She texted back a photo of her holding a potted tomato plant sitting on the porch of our old house. 90 days is enough time to get the garden growing. We'll be ready. I smiled, but it faded when Kael'thar tapped my shoulder, his face grim. He pulled up an intercepted memo from Voreth's office, dated 10 minutes after the ruling. It was a draft of a new petition to reclassify Earth as a non-sentient resource extraction zone, rather than a sovereign inhabited planet, so that Clause 77B wouldn't apply, since the tabling only covered directives targeting sentient species. If they passed that, they could start strip mining the planet tomorrow. No annihilation needed, no loophole required. I stared at the memo for a minute, then I leaned back in my chair and picked up my tablet. I'd spent 3 years fighting developers who tried to rezone residential areas as industrial to avoid paying property taxes. I knew every loophole in the UN's 2027 Declaration of Sentient Sovereignty, the one the Vera had recognized when they first made contact with Earth. Tell Hale to wake up, I said, tapping the screen to pull up the declaration. We've got another petition to write. The countdown to the end of the 90 days was already ticking in the corner of my monitor, red numbers glowing in the dim bunker light. The Vera weren't going to give up. They were proud, arrogant, and they hated losing. But for the first time since the ultimatum dropped, I wasn't scared. I was a zoning clerk from Des Moines. I knew how to fight with paperwork. And I had 90 days to make sure they never got the chance to use theirs. The hum of the bunker's recycled air filled the silence after the vote, broken only by the sharp tick of the cheap Walmart digital clock we'd looted last month, its red 90 glowing in the corner of the desk. Voreth's draft memo was still pulled up on my tablet, the typo in the first line, reclassification, so stupidly human I almost laughed. Almost. Kael'thar's golden markings had faded to a dull amber, his shoulders slumping as he leaned over my shoulder, a clawed finger tapping the clause Voreth had highlighted at the bottom of the page. Per Custodial Charter Section 12.4, non-sentient resource extraction zones are exempt from all sovereignty protections under Clause 77B. No sentience assessment required for extraction permits. They think they can slide this through while the tribunal is tied up with Thalkar's review, he said, his voice rough. He'd been awake for 40 hours straight, same as the rest of us, the stress of being a defector making his usually steady markings flicker like a faulty bulb. The tabling only blocks actions targeting the Thalkar mandate. Reclassifying the planet isn't targeting the mandate, it's administrative. I leaned back in my creaking folding chair, the legs digging into the concrete floor, and pulled up the UN 2027 Declaration of Sentient Sovereignty I'd memorized back in 2028, when the Vera first made contact, and I spent 3 nights straight cross-referencing it with every scrap of custodial charter text I could pull from the public feed. I'd fought 17 rezoning fights in Des Moines before the ultimatum dropped, 17 times beating developers who tried to use loopholes in municipal code to turn residential neighborhoods into industrial parks to dodge property taxes. This wasn't different, it was just bigger. Tell Hale to wake up, I said, tapping my screen to pull up the full text of the custodial charter's reclassification procedures. We've got paperwork to file. Hale grumbled so loud I heard him bang his head on the bunk bed frame upstairs, but he was down in the bunker 5 minutes later, a can of cherry energy drink in one hand, a half-eaten granola bar in the other, his hoodie stained with something that looked like engine grease and Pop-Tart filling. Kael'thar walked him through the reclassification process while I pulled up every zoning appeal I'd ever filed, every municipal code loophole I'd ever exploited, every court precedent I'd ever cited. The Vera didn't just hate losing, they hated procedural inconsistency more. Their entire empire was built on the myth of the custodial charter's infallibility, that their rules were perfect, unbiased, unbreakable. They'd never even considered that someone would use their own damn rules against them. That was the flaw I'd spent 3 years waiting for them to hand me. Any reclassification petition has to be published on the public custodial docket for 15 sols before it can be voted on, Kael'thar said, his markings flaring bright when he hit the relevant clause. And if the affected species files a formal objection during that period, the petition is automatically stayed pending a full tribunal hearing. The tribunal is already locked in the 90-day Thalkar review. They can't hold a hearing on the reclassification until after the tabling expires. Minimum 90 more days of no bombs, no strip mining, nothing. Hale's eyes lit up. So we just file an objection? Easy. Voreth will try to dismiss it, I said, scrolling through the charter's rules for objections. He'll claim we're not a recognized interested party, that our proof of sentience is biased, that the objection is a stalling tactic. He'll cite precedent 7.2, the one where the tribunal dismissed an objection from a pre-industrial species because their proof of sentience was just oral history with no written documentation. Kael'thar nodded. He's done it before. He stripped 3 pre-industrial species of their protected status last cycle using that exact argument. Good. I cracked my knuckles, pulling up a blank template for a custodial petition I'd reverse-engineered from 12 previous filings I'd pulled from the public feed. Then we make the objection so bulletproof he can't dismiss it without looking like he's ignoring his own damn rules. And if he does that, the Thalkar tabling falls apart because his original incompetence charge against Thalkar relied on the exact same procedural requirements he's trying to throw out now. We worked through the night. Hale set up an autofiler script to watch the public custodial docket, so the second Vorath's reclassification petition went live, our objection would be filed 0.2 seconds later before he could even file a motion to freeze public comment. Kael'thar helped me structure the proof of sentience appendix, 400 pages of human history organized exactly to match the Vera's own sentience assessment guidelines. 200 pages of evidence of species-wide coordinated problem-solving, zoning laws, the International Space Station, the 2027 Climate Accords, the Internet, public health systems, 150 pages of cultural production that transcended immediate survival, Shakespeare, quantum physics, jazz, preschool education, the recipe for chocolate chip cookies, which Kael'thar had tried last week and declared evidence of a species capable of prioritizing joy over caloric efficiency, and 50 pages of diplomatic correspondence with the Vera themselves. From the first contact protocol in 2020, 8 to the 90-day tabling ruling we'd gotten 12 hours earlier. I even used the exact same template I'd used for the 2019 zoning appeal against the strip mall developer who tried to rezone Maple Street from residential to industrial. Same header, same citation format, same argument structure. The proposed action violates existing protective rules. The petitioner has no standing to bypass those rules, and granting the petition would set a precedent that undermines the entire legal framework the petitioner claims to be upholding. I just swapped Maple Street residential zone for Planet-Earth sovereign inhabited status, and Des Moines Municipal Code Section 4.2 for Custodial Charter Clause 77b. At 0001 Vera Standard Time the next day, the docket pinged. Voreth's reclassification petition was live, titled Petition to Reclassify Planet Earth as Non-Sentient Resource Extraction Zone, exempt from sovereignty protections. Zero point 0.2 seconds later, our objection hit the docket, titled Formal Objection to Reclassification Petition 2020-6734, submitted by the sovereign species of planet Earth with supporting proof of sentience and third-party xenosociological validation. The public feed blew up. I watched the vote count on the Thalkar tabling flicker for half a second before stabilizing. 62 to 38, same as before. No one had changed their vote yet, but the comments section was chaos. Voreth filed a motion to dismiss our objection 10 minutes later, claiming Kael'thar's third-party validation was invalid because he was a defector with a grudge against the custodial authority, and that our proof of sentience was self-reported and therefore inherently unreliable. I wrote the response in 3 hours, 12 pages of single-spaced text citing 17 separate veracustodial precedents, including Precedent 2147.3, which explicitly states that defector testimony is admissible in all custodial proceedings as long as the defector has no current affiliation with either party in the dispute. I also cited Precedent 1892.1, the one the tribunal used to dismiss Voreth's own petition to strip the pre-industrial species of Kael'thar's homeworld of protected status 3 cycles prior, noting that dismissing our objection would require the tribunal to overturn its own prior ruling, invalidating every reclassification decision it had made in the last 12 cycles, including the very precedent Voreth was trying to use to dismiss us. I signed it with my full name, my Des Moines zoning clerk ID number, and a scanned copy of my 2029 voter registration card, just to drive home the point that I was just a regular human, not a spy, not a soldier, just a guy who knew how to read fine print. The tribunal ruled 3 days later while we were all passed out on the bunker floor, Hale drooling on a stack of printed custodial charter text, Kael'thar curled up in the corner with his markings dim. The ruling pinged across the public feed at 3 a.m. local time. Objection 2026-734A is hereby upheld as procedurally valid. The third-party xenosociological validation submitted by Kael'thar of the dissolved Thalkar mandate is admissible per Precedent 2147.3. The proof of sentience submitted by the species of planet Earth meets all requirements outlined in Sentience Assessment Guidelines 9b. Reclassification Petition 2026-734 is stayed pending the conclusion of the 90-day tabling period for Mandate 2026-112 Thalkar Earth Mandate. The tribunal notes that any attempt to dismiss this objection would require overturning Precedent 1892.1, which would undermine the legitimacy of the custodial charter itself. Procedural consistency is non-negotiable. The bunker erupted. Hale whooped so loud he set off the motion sensor in the hallway. Kael'thar's markings flared bright gold, so bright they lit up the whole room, and he grabbed my shoulders laughing, that same bright, unburdened sound he'd made when the tabling vote passed. I sat there for a minute staring at the ruling, the red 90 on the clock still ticking, and then I pulled out my phone and texted Leela. Second round 1. 90 just turned into 180 minimum. She sent back a photo 30 seconds later. The tomato seeds we'd planted in a pot on the porch before I left had sprouted, tiny green leaves pushing up through the dirt. 180 days is enough time to get the whole garden going, she wrote. We'll be ready. I smiled, but it faded when I looked back at the docket. Voreth had already filed a motion for reconsideration, citing new evidence that Kael'thar had falsified his xenosociological credentials. I sighed, rubbing the grit out of my eyes. He wasn't going to stop. Tell Hale to wake up, I said, tapping my screen to pull up the template for a formal petition to have Earth recognized as a sovereign sentient species under the custodial charter, a petition I'd started drafting 3 years prior, back when I was still fighting strip mall developers in Des Moines and the Vera were just a weird news story about a weird UN contact. We've got a preemptive filing to get ready. By the time the 90 days are up, Earth is going to be so officially, undeniably sovereign that Voreth won't even be able to file a reclassification petition without it being automatically dismissed as moot. Kael'thar leaned over my shoulder, his markings soft and amused. You know, most species spend all their military budget on dreadnoughts and plasma weapons when the Vera show up. I snorted, typing the first line of the petition, using the exact same language I'd used in 1,000 zoning appeals. The petitioner respectfully requests that the custodial tribunal recognize the inherent, inalienable sovereignty of planet Earth and its sapient human population, per the terms of the 2027 UN Declaration of Sentient Sovereignty and Custodial Charter Clause 77b, and that any future petitions to reclassify Earth as a non-sentient resource extraction zone be barred as inconsistent with this ruling. Most species don't have a zoning clerk from Des Moines, I said, and took a sip of the cold, stale coffee that had been sitting on the desk since yesterday. Developers think rules are just suggestions, too. Turns out alien empires are the same way. The clock ticked. 90 days, 14 hours, 22 minutes left. And for the first time since the Vera's ultimatum dropped, I didn't feel scared. I felt like I was finally doing the job I'd been trained for, just on a bigger scale. The Vera thought we were primitive, that we'd crumble under their threat. They'd never even considered that we'd fight them with the same boring, tedious, unglamorous paperwork we used to fight every other bully who tried to push us around. I glanced at the docket again. Vorath's motion for reconsideration was already getting buried under 10,000 comments from Vera citizens calling him a hack for trying to overturn Precedent 1892.1. Even his own people thought he was being an idiot. I leaned back in my chair and cracked a smile. We weren't just going to survive the 90 days. We were going to make sure the Vera never even thought about threatening us again. All it took was a few hundred pages of fine print and a whole lot of stubbornness. The tomatoes were going to be just fine. Chapter 12, the cherry tomato on the windowsill turned fully red at 00:17 left on the 90-day clock. Kael'thar leaned in the doorway, his usually lazy, rippling Vera markings tight with uncharacteristic stress, a datapad in his four-fingered grip flashing urgent red. Vorath just filed a motion to toll the entire review period. Claims the UN failed to effect proper service of your petition on the Vera High Council, so the 90-day window never actually started. His security detachment is en route to the basement now, authorized to seize and destroy all copies of the filing. He says it's evidence of procedural fraud. Internal security is refusing to intervene. He cited Clause 8J of the Vera Administrative Code to justify the seizure. I didn't look up from the stack of annotated custodial charter printouts spread across my desk. The pink highlighter I'd used for zoning code cross-references still smudged on my thumb. Tell him his internal audit office already has the delivery confirmation. Kael'thar blinked, his markings flickering with confusion, and tapped his own datapad a few times. The red flash slowed, then died out entirely, replaced by 3 scanned copies of a Vera Central Interdepartmental Mail Service delivery form, each signed by a different clerk, timestamped 89 days, 23 hours and 58 minutes prior to the current time. How the hell did you? 3 weeks of digging through the charter's fine print after I filed the first draft, I said, finally looking up and nodded at the annotated printouts. Clause 12C. All official petitions to the custodial tribunal have to be routed through the Vera's own mail service, because the Empire thinks lesser species are too stupid to file paperwork correctly and would clog their docket. I sent it via certified interdepartmental mail, return receipt requested, and CC'd every single Vera citizen who commented on Vorath's reclassification motion, plus the audit office, the ombudsman for public petitions, and those 3 legal advocacy groups that have been filing complaints against Vorath for abusing his authority for the last 6 years. Kael'thar's markings went soft, then bright with amused shock, and he held up his datapad again, scrolling through a feed of incoming notifications. The 10,000 commenters just filed a class action motion to strike his tolling request, citing Precedent 1892.1. The Ombudsman already issued a preliminary injunction barring Vorath's security detachment from entering UN property. And the 3 male clerks who signed the delivery form, they just filed a formal complaint against Vorath for ordering them to hide the confirmation last month when he first tried to delay service. The basement speakers crackled, the automated voice of the custodial tribunal flat and unreadable as the clock hit 00:00. Petition for sovereignty of planet Earth filed by my name is hereby ratified. Precedent 1892.1 is invoked to bar all future reclassification motions for the terrestrial system. The Vera Empire is ordered to cease all hostile actions against Earth immediately, under penalty of revocation of all Vera custodial charter privileges across all occupied territories. The door behind Kael'thar burst open, and 4 Vera security officers in black armor stormed in, stun batons raised, only to freeze when 2 internal security agents in crisp blue uniforms stepped into the hallway behind them, holding a digital warrant. The lead agent stepped past the frozen security detail, her markings stern. High Counselor Vorath is under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of official authority, and attempted theft of sovereign territory. His motion to toll the review period was the final straw after 17 months of citizen complaints. Kael'thar snickered, leaning against the doorframe as the officers were cuffed and led away. He's going to be spending the next 20 years filing zoning appeals from a minimum security administrative prison on a frozen moon in the Outer Rim. The Vera love making their own corrupt officials suffer through paperwork as punishment. It's a very effective deterrent. I laughed, reaching over to the windowsill to pick the ripe cherry tomato off the vine. its skin warm from the humming fluorescent light overhead. I popped it in my mouth, sweet and tart, the exact same taste as the ones I'd grown in the community garden behind my strip mall office in Des Moines. The stale coffee on my desk had gone cold again, but I took a sip anyway and smiled. I opened a new document on my laptop, typed the header at the top of the blank page. Petition for custodial charter funding for global zoning and environmental protection frameworks, filed on behalf of all sentient species currently under Vera custodianship. The developers in Des Moines always said zoning rules were a waste of time, a bunch of red tape designed to stop progress. Turns out they were the only thing standing between Earth and being a strip mall for an alien empire. The tomatoes, I thought, glancing back at the half dozen still ripening on the sill, were going to be just fine.